Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Security Testing, the podcast where we talk all things security testing. My name is Ben.
And I'm Tom.
And today we're going to talk about how to run an enterprise testing program. So, where do we start here, Tom? Why don't you tell us what we mean by an enterprise testing program if that's not the buzzword language?
Yeah, I think an enterprise testing program is really a program that you're trying to run at a scale that means you have multiple different stakeholders, multiple different requirements. You've probably got lots of application teams and infrastructure teams disconnected from each other, and obviously there are challenges that appear as a result of that sort of complex interconnected web. It's not you have a single product that has a single defined process and key specific people who are responsible for one element of it. Instead, you have this entire ecosystem that you have to contend with.
Yeah, there are, if we go right to the bottom of the ladder when it comes to, size of business and, when you get to a size where you need to do some form of security testing, you might have a few servers and maybe an application to test once a year manually, scanning it every month. The challenge you have is that as those numbers get greater and greater and greater, you also get bigger and bigger and bigger, which means the risk increases, right? So not only have you got more assets to test, you also are the limitations of a point-in-time testing program, if we want to call it that, are highlighted to a greater degree, right?
Yeah, it's not just that as well, right? It's the mandate to get testing done increases usually. Not necessarily always true, right? But typically, enterprise organizations are the organizations most heavily regulated, most audited. They've got internal governance requirements to do testing. They've probably got government entity mandated, and certainly they'll have customer requirements to do testing. So the driving force behind getting the testing done is the risk, sure, but it's also the people inside and external to your business who are telling you this needs to be done in different ways for different reasons.
Yeah, of course. And naturally, the bigger you get, the more likely you are to be the one enforcing security testing on your suppliers. And I've spoken about this before on the podcast, but the number one reason for getting testing done in 2024 is customer driven, right? It's no longer, sure, there are compliance frameworks, sure, there are things like PCI, there are regulatory environments you can operate in, but the one thing that's consistently affects everybody is that your customers or their suppliers, the rules are getting tighter. And these aren't rules set by institutions or governments. These rules are set by specific companies and what their risk tolerance for their suppliers is.
So, obviously, that sounds like quite a mountain of a topic to overcome. Where should we start? What's
Let's start with where the customer starts. What do you do when you're going to build an enterprise security testing program? I'll tell you what I see actually happening in a lot of cases, and it builds over time and grows over time. The problem with building and growing over time is you end up adding things on instead of building into, if that makes sense. What does that actually look like? It looks like disparate teams doing testing in potentially different ways, different suppliers doing the same things, different technologies, like, for example, we've got SAST, we've got DAST, we've got human testing, we've got bug bounty. Those things can all feed off each other really, really well. Practically, they were all bought at separate times by separate people, and they're run as standalone instances, centralized in some kind of vulnerability management platform, which is seen as the interconnected thing. The tools, just because their output's connected doesn't mean that the tools are connected. So I think I think a really good talking point for us here will be, if you are genuinely brought into an organization, say for example you are a new CISO in a 10,000 staff plus business with all of the above to consider, And actually, you've got it as a strategic mandate, whether given by the board or something you just want to achieve, to build from the ground up a security testing program. As broad as that sounds, where do you start then?
I think
nothing's off the table.
Yeah. I think if you're walking into a new organisation and you have the understanding, because obviously that is the first thing. You have the understanding of the organisation's risk appetite, the available tools to that organisation. Then I think you have to sort of ask yourself two, maybe three questions. You have to ask yourself what you actually have to do, because there will be things, like I say, there are regulations, there are requirements, there are things that you cannot avoid testing in certain ways. Maybe you're PCI regulated, for example, or you are needing to do check testing for public data. Then you need to ask what you want to do. What are the strategic objectives of the organisation, and how can security testing help meet those strategic objectives? And then the third thing that you ask is, what can you currently do so that you can start figuring out that roadmap towards getting to the place where you're doing all of the things that you have to and all of the things that you're supposed to do.
I would add a fourth one to that, and I would say it's understanding from the outset what your tolerance is likely to be. Because we've spoken about this before, but you can't test everything for every minute of every day all of the time, right? That's obvious from the outset. But understanding what your tolerance is going to be. I think we live in a world now where there's 9 different scanning tools, for different things. You could, in theory, go and get a best of breed solution for each. You could take a unified platform view, which is going to naturally have limitations in certain areas. We've spoken about human testing and the idea of human testing being brought in much more frequently than the annual. But then you are literally sat on top of an unlimited budget at this point, right? So I would say a fourth one is understanding what your tolerance is going to be. We speak about this in patch management a lot of the times. It's fairly standard for businesses to go, okay, we're not going to be able to patch instantly, but we want to patch within 3 days, get all the processes done around testing it, etc. Same applies here, really. It's a case of going, okay, who are we up against? Is it nation states where a 0 day is potentially going to compromise our business in hours? Or are we in the fortunate position of being able to take a more relaxed but overall more thorough approach in the long run?
Yeah, the tolerance is an interesting one, right? Because it's really, really hard to understand what the implications of with security testing, what the implications of setting those tolerance boundaries are. Is it a tolerance for the amount of time that a vulnerability is present within a system without being detected? Is it the amount of time once a vulnerability has been detected before it gets remediated? And what are you benchmarking those against? If you've got HTTP headers, which is very, very common, security misconfiguration across a lot of different applications, there's no real impact to that directly. Indirectly, it can help facilitate another attack. But if you're going to be defining a tolerance and saying, I cannot tolerate HTTP header misconfigurations, or I cannot tolerate any security misconfiguration being present in a system for more than a month without being detected and 3 months without being remediated, then that becomes unrealistic, right? That becomes it's not pragmatic to say that you're going to do that across the entire business with vulnerabilities like that or weaknesses like that. So then you start getting into this world of how granular you need to go with these sorts of...
Well, you're focusing there on the vulnerability, but you could also equally focus on the asset. And that I see is much more common, right? Is you can absolutely turn up the dial on tools and testing for certain assets, right? You might have a business critical app that is absolutely central and the one your customers use, the one your suppliers use, the one that really could cause business disruption if it was compromised. You then might have 2 or 3 back office apps, same thing, in-house developed, in-house supported, but much less likely to get compromised, much more heavier gates to get through to even see the app from an external perspective. And you might take a lighter approach to say, actually, whilst there's an equal amount of opportunity for a vulnerability to be created in that system, there is a significantly less likelihood of it being exploited, and therefore, I don't think when we talk about security, the cadence of security testing, we are talking about the cadence increasing the rate at which you find things. It's more detecting them quicker, right? It's not finding more, it's finding them quicker. Ultimately, if you take the approach I mentioned earlier of saying we're just going to scan everything every month and manually test it every year, as long as they're good scanners and good tests, you'll probably still find an equal amount of things to somebody doing the faster approach. You just won't find them as quick. So really the asset does matter when we're considering the cadence of testing.
It does, but you've got to be obviously, I don't want to say careful, but you've got to be strict and clear and definitive when you are setting out those policies, because otherwise you end up with what we spoke about at the start, this sort of fractured security testing where you've got different tools being used by different teams in different ways, and you've not really got any organisational oversight over the operations or any real level of confidence that you can tell a customer, we do get tested at this cadence, we do have this strategy in place. And also, you have to be really, really, really confident in your asset inventory and your risk profiles of each of those assets to be able to say that dev system in UAT that hasn't been touched in 6 months isn't actually holding, let's say, some domain credentials that could be used to wreak havoc on your entire infrastructure estate.
Yeah, and okay, so I've got my assets listed out in terms of criticality. I've got my risk tolerance and acceptance. I know what I need to do on these assets. I know what I want to do on these assets. I have that all written down. It's taken me 6 weeks. What do I do now? What are the things I need to consider in terms of operationalising this plan?
What tools you have available, and what, shouldn't just say tools, what resources you have available to actually get the testing done, right? Do you have people within your business, for example, who are able to manually test for those kinds of vulnerabilities that scanners aren't able to find? And do you have people able to feed and water the scanners and tune them in the way that they need to be tuned in order to actually get them to work? Do you have a method of being able to validate and remove false positives from the scanners once they've completed their actions? And do you have a way to aggregate that data so that you actually have an organisational oversight and you're not just doing these sort of bitty vulnerability management by email and spreadsheet and so on?
Yeah, that makes sense. And let's just stay external for a second then. So, I'm obviously I've got this list. I obviously know there's going to be providers to support this list. Sure, we might have incumbents, but just to keep the scenario, as I said it earlier, nothing's off the table. Building this from scratch. Every vendor's going to tell you they can do 50, 60, 70, 80% of that list. And there are vendors that have strong dual or even triple capability when it comes to multiple scanners, whether it comes to we have a scanner and a great testing function. What should we be thinking there when we're engaging with these vendors? I mean, the common approach, if we stick with tools, is run the tools side by side and see what they find. Whichever one finds the greatest, we pick that one. I mean, that's been the sort of sales approach on both sides for years. Limitations with that, for sure.
Yeah. The problem with running the tools side by side is you need a massive, massive sample size to be able to actually say with any level of confidence that it's representative, right? One tool is going to be better at testing ASP applications, another tool might be better at testing Java applications. You start running into all of these different edge cases and nuances that make it really, really hard to be able to compare apples with apples. I think organisations are leaning towards consolidation quite a lot in this, right? Being able to understand what tools work together cohesively, so that realistically, while they're not necessarily on their own always the best tool for the job, between them, they're able to get the greatest breadth and depth of coverage across the organisation. But I also think finding vendors who are able to provide you with information about what their tools cannot do, That's something vendors are awful at. Like, it's hard, right? You don't want to admit that there are things that you're not particularly capable of. But finding vendors who are openly clear and honest, we are strong in this area, we are not so strong in this area, but maybe another vendor is strong in that area, is massively, massively important in you being able to actually build a program that is devoid of massive gaps in it, especially gaps that you don't know about.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly pertinent when asking around can be another really good way of doing that as well, because people tend to also have those opinions.
Yeah, this industry lives on referrals, right?
100%. So if we're talking about operationalizing resourcing, I've gone out, I've sampled a few vendors. I think I might have built the capabilities that I need. Where do we sit then with how do humans fall into this? From a human testing perspective, not from a managing of the program.
Yeah, well, as I say, there are vulnerabilities that tools cannot find. Mm-hmm. Business logic flaws are the one that I scream about until I'm blue in the face, right? There are other vulnerabilities as well, like complex identity and access management issues. But business logic flaws are the classic example of a vulnerability that we know that tools that are presently on the market are not capable of finding. And that goes for static scanning and dynamic scanning. So we need to find a way to be able to find those specific kinds of vulnerabilities across applications, but it's really, really, really hard. It's not hard to get a person to find it. Like you say, you can bring somebody in once a year and they can go through the entire application and they can find a bunch of business logic flaws for you. But what's really, really hard is to do that at the sort of cadence that organizations need, at the same cadence that they're getting their dynamic scans run. So we need to find ways to be able to quickly assign the response or quickly orchestrate the testers to start looking for those kinds of vulnerabilities at the times that that they might be there and in the places that they might be there. And I'm just a massive advocate for a scientific approach to doing this, right? You could say, just keep poking around the systems and we'll hope that you find it throughout the year. But instead, if you say, if you build into your software development lifecycle some sort of a mechanism, a trigger to say, if these kinds of changes occur, then we probably need a person to look at it. If these kinds of changes occur, we probably need a tool to look at it. Then we can effectively start to make sure that the manual testers and the people are being folded in at the times that they're needed.
Yeah, and we see hacked together versions of this with, we see the use of things like clinics, whereby product teams, development teams will sit down and have meetings with security, usually someone in a governance position, who can make a call on the risks and what type of testing to perform. But when we're talking about building this thing from scratch, that's an incredible human cost to add into the process, particularly if we're building at the speed that a lot of businesses are building at. That quickly becomes untenable if we're scaling. Another really, really important thing to remember that might sound obvious is, aside from the sort of continuous approach, where we do need those traditional tests, where we do need those baseline tests, going back to the strategy of what is compliant, what is regulatory, etc. Bring somebody in, do it yourselves, get it all scoped up front, understand the effort needed to roughly test each system, having all of that in a log, costed, ready to go, also massively speeds up any process for getting security testing done. Treating every single app like a project is one way of doing it, but ultimately there are some steps that are just unskippable and can absolutely be done in bulk. It doesn't really matter if you change vendor. Trust me, if you go to a pen testing vendor and say, hey, this is the system, this is what it looks like, this is roughly how long it should take to test it, they will thank you for it. So just bear that stuff in mind when we're doing that planning piece. And I guess just finally, it would be wrong of us to not talk about output, right? Because all of these systems are going to spit out vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. All of these systems are going to have a certain percentage of false positives. All of these systems are going to find similar vulnerabilities, if not the same vulnerabilities in certain cases. Mm-hmm. Some of these systems will be looped straight back into development, as we see is quite common with things like SAST and SCA. Some of these systems will be looped directly into the security team and then triaged in some way, validated possibly, and then looped back into the engineering product teams for fixing as more as a ticket than as a active piece of work that just continuously happens. How much of that, I don't want to get into a conversation about vulnerability management, that's definitely for another day, but how much of that output should we be considering from the outset?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, the challenge of there's loads and loads of data points that you're picking up right throughout the test, not just vulnerabilities that have been identified, but where in systems the vulnerabilities have been identified, when they've been identified, whether there's consistent themes between the vulnerabilities being identified, and also just what's gone on, right? It's not all about the vulnerabilities. As we've said, one of the most fundamental driving forces behind tests is that there is a mandate, that there is a customer or there is a government entity or regulator, whomever, that is telling you need to do the testing. So one of the most crucial data points that needs to be taken as output is what's been tested, when's it been tested, what's it been tested for, and what's the rationale behind that decision. Organizations are given massive amounts of control over how they actually run their testing programs. Might not always feel like that, but they are. They are actually given a lot of discretion about how to do these things. So being able to provide an auditable trail, or making sure that your output is actually going into an auditable trail and isn't just a series of PDFs that are pinged backwards and forwards over email that say, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure we did a test something like 6, 7, 8 months ago, and calling that the record of the security, especially the record of the current state of security of your application, because a report from 6 or 7 months ago is not an accurate reflection of the current security posture. I think that's fundamental. It is interesting what you spoke about with the SAST and the DAST stuff. I know we don't want to touch on vulnerability management, but one thing that I've learned, especially in enterprise, is that application teams are typically fairly siloed from security teams. And I think that's why a lot of these vulnerabilities don't get fed directly into the application teams. It's really, really easy if you're using a SaaS tool to just click a button, and when that PR gets raised, for that SaaS tool to automatically report those findings or comment them on the PR so that the developer gets direct access to them. It's really, really difficult if you bring in a pen tester 9 months after that PR has been merged into staging or into production, and that pen tester finds those vulnerabilities and passes them to the security team, for the security team to get that into the development team. So, I think that there is a lot of merit to just simply looking at what processes you have to disseminate that information in a faster and more sort of streamlined way into your development teams, just as importantly as it is to pass them into your security and risk management teams.
100%. And I guess finally, we just need to consider bottlenecks, right? That's what this comes down to, is when we're looking at the plan, where are the bottlenecks going to be? One of the really common ones I see is we have this grandiose idea that DAST results should be fed into security for them to vet in the same way they would vet pen testing results, because they're similar in nature. The problem is DAST tools can be quite noisy, and if you don't have the manpower in the security team to triage all of the DAST results, guess what ends up happening? They end up getting past the development without being validated or really looked through. What does that do to development? They go, I've just raised a ticket for this vulnerability that didn't turn out to be a vulnerability. So looking for those bottlenecks in advance and going, if you are going to put a process in that makes sense, make sure you can staff it appropriately, and you're not putting too much work on a specific team.
Cool.
Cool. I mean, how would you summarise today's episode? What do you think some of the key takeaways are that we've covered?
I think, define your strategy and make sure that it is targeted. So you're not treating everything exactly the same, but at the same time not so fractured that you don't know what's going on and you can't say confidently to the people who want to know what's actually happening inside your environment. Understand what you're capable of actually doing where you need some help and where you're able to accomplish things yourself inside the business, and don't be afraid to go out and seek solutions to help make sure that you can actually orchestrate and oversee what's going on across your entire organization, in order to identify the bottlenecks, treat the bottlenecks, and just try and remove friction throughout the process.
Makes total sense. The topic for the next episode is going to be why context matters to pen testers. That's something that I know is close to Tom's heart. And just as a reminder to everybody listening, you can also find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Amazon Music. And follow us on LinkedIn, because we've got some really big events coming up over the next 3 months. I'm sure some of you guys will be really keen to get involved with. Thanks for listening, and we'll speak to you in a couple of weeks.
Bye now.